you will have a situation where it's not just projecting agency onto something inanimate, but something that really does seem to have agency. And people will organize around that. I think there will be religious sects that, have a model trained specifically for them, and they go to it for counsel, and they let it determine their ethics.
AI, we're talking about it some more. Sam Hammond is the director of social polity at the Niskanen Center and author of the Substack Second Best. And Zohar Atkins is the Substack rabbi. He hosts the truly fantastic podcast, Meditations with Zohar, writes a philosophy Substack at What Is Called Thinking, and does weekly Torah analysis at Etz Hasadeh. Welcome to China Talk, which I guess is turning to AI Talk. I'm totally fine with that. Sam and Zohar.
Hey, Jordan.
Great to be here.
Appreciate the enthusiasm. So at 9 a.m. on December 16th, Zohar, what are the questions we should be asking about?
I come to this question not really as a trend forecaster or somebody who's worried about the future, but really somebody who's interested in anthropology and the opportunity that AI affords us to self-reflect on what makes us different than robots. So as AI becomes more sophisticated and more capable of passing the Turing test, it reveals the extent to which most of the time our thoughts, feelings, and scripts could basically be written by GPT, if not written better by a robot. And I think that is distressing. A lot of people have sort of taken to this point. Nate Silver said that one of the upsides of GPT is sort of that it will reveal how mediocre we are. And I guess that is a new problem in a way, but it's also an old problem because Plato in the Phaedrus, or Socrates in the Phaedrus, was worried that writing itself would basically allow human beings to simulate knowledge rather than to actually have it. And I kind of agree. I think that one of the features of technology is that we can pretend to know when in fact we don't. And so asking what it is that we can know that a computer can't know is probably the most important question right now. When we look at GPT and it gives us an answer to a question and seems to have knowledge, what does that mean for us when we give similar answers?
That's a big window for you to jump through.
Yeah, I tend to agree with the philosopher and writer Yasha Bach that the development of AI is the greatest philosophy project in human history. That by constructing an alien mind, and this sort of comports with what Zohar said, we're learning about how our mind works, and answering fundamental questions in a way that isn't just theoretical, like armchair speculation, but building actual toy model examples of how our brain works, and being able to reverse engineer that from the ground up. And the big open question that I have is, will this be a centralizing or decentralizing force? I think that the assumption so far has been that it will be centralizing, because if you have tons of money to build these giant models and lots of big data sets that only large corporations or governments could have, you have a persistent advantage. And it definitely seems like there will be always these huge models that only mega corporations can afford to run. But I think what we're realizing is on the edge, even things that aren't state of the art will quickly diffuse into the public and give ordinary citizens far more capabilities than they ever had in the past.
So I was like tweeting some random things about like not particularly generous things about people who were criticizing AI art, and the sort of amount of vitriol which came back at me was stronger than like anything I've ever done in a China context. Zohar, like what is like driving, aside from just like people being scared of losing their jobs, like what are the deeper levels of fear that folks are sort of, coming into existential dread over when facing these new models?
One of the fears, as you mentioned, might just be a practical one of sort of feeling irrelevant.
Yeah.
Another is probably the psychological fear of just the unknown in general, which you often have with technological shifting. And then I think in terms of the specifics of this this AI turn, maybe people are particularly afraid that creativity, or what they perceive as creativity, is being disrupted. So it's a lot easier to, again, maybe we have a bias because we live in sort of cosmopolitan-y kind of cities. I'm projecting here. But if you live in kind of a bluish bubble, so you can look to automation and disruption as happening to other people, like it's happening to manufacturers in Ohio, for example, the Rust Belt, but you don't think that it's coming for you. So I think there's a particular anxiety when it comes for the creative class, which is like, oh, wait a second, what if AI makes writing and having thoughts irrelevant and producing cartoons irrelevant? And it actually is better at making those things irrelevant than, let's say, putting together machinery on a Toyota assembly line or something like that. Like, I think that in a way is a kind of comeuppance for, I hate to sound folksy here, but coastal elites.
It seems like, at least in the near term, AI could have an extremely egalitarian effect on closing these innate and environmental differences between sort of word cell ability to manipulate language, art, creativity. And those things have really forever, but especially in the 20th century, became very important markers of status and meritocracy. And in particular in American culture, where we put such a high value on self-expression and authenticity, the fact that somebody with an accent or with dyslexia or any other thing that affects their writing ability, let's say, will now be able to compete and spar with other people by just putting their ideas. They have the same thoughts, they have the same caliber ideas, but have difficulty articulating them. If they're on the same level playing field, it's both amazing for society in that sense, but it will also cause a lot of teeth gnashing, not just because we're losing creativity per se, but it's who in particular is losing their position in the rank of status in society.
I definitely agree that there's a status anxiety thing going on, and probably just in terms of basic economic modeling, if you increase the supply of thought pieces, then you inherently decrease the price. Right. So, but at the same time, if we disambiguate what a thought piece is, and we say that most thought pieces are mid-wit, mid-level, whatever. So those are the ones that are going to feel the most pain. I think in a way, this is an amazing thing for people who are truly differentiated and truly original. And it will create more of a winner-take-all scenario where those who sort of stand apart from learned language modeling and can actually do something that doesn't feel like a robot did it will have the ability to sort of create a new niche or something like this. So I saw Mark Andreessen tweeted recently about something. It's as if GPT wrote this, and I feel like more and more we're going to have that reaction to actual things that human beings write. And so then when you then stumble upon a work of art that you don't feel that, it's going to feel even more wow because of the contrast.
It'll be interesting, like how much un-GPT-able things, to what extent people will like go towards un-GPT-able things, like, I don't know, live theater, or I don't know, like physical paintings or what have you, just to sort of be be confident that like the machine wasn't 100% the creator behind this sort of stuff.
Yeah, but this is going to be a very interstitial period.
Yeah.
It's going to be like the 2-year window where there's actually still a gap. And you saw the same thing in chess, where there was a period where chess AIs were really, really good, but teams of human and chess players were better than just the AI alone. And that was a wonderful sort of like 3-year golden year period. And then eventually the AI was just 1,000 ELO points better than Magnus Carlsen. And now there's even new models that will play in the particular style of a particular player. And so it's not just sort of playing game theory optimal, but capturing some aspect of the style and the uniqueness and authenticity of a player's style. And so we're going to be in for, ChatGPT isn't the end; it's just the beginning, and that model itself is a small fraction of the size of the full GPT-3 model, which is too big to let everyone on Earth access at the same time for free. But GPT-4 comes out early next year, and there are other models like Chinchilla that are open source that are doing more or less the same thing, but without any of the filters.
Zohar, we're next.
I guess I'd be interested to hear Sam's perspective on what he
Yeah.
thinks is new with this specific wave of AI versus, other forms of AI versus just technology in general. And I know you've written about the singularity and sort of favorably, you seem to endorse the thesis, at least in broad strokes. So what does the long-term future hold? How much is determinate, and how much can policy or preparation sort of change the way that this can go?
Yeah, it's interesting. These trends are occurring sort of in parallel with research in neuroscience and computational neurobiology, where we're learning more and more about how the brain actually works and seeing and understanding how its architecture is in many ways very analogous to these deep learning reinforcement models. Right now, when I introspect on what I'm doing as I'm speaking, it's not that I'm forming coherent thoughts and then speaking them. It's that you just asked me a question, which has prompted me, and my brain is retrieving through myriad associations and things that I've already read, and sort of auto-generating my response. And in some ways, it seems like, what it means to be human is to be in this kind of loop of prompting and and responding, and that becomes culture. So I think that, Richard Dawkins had this book, Unweaving the Rainbow, where he argued that scientific understanding of natural phenomena doesn't remove the beauty of those phenomena. That if you understand that rainbows are just particles of water that refract light in certain ways, it far from removing the beauty of the rainbow, it actually lets you appreciate the rainbow even more. I think this time could be different, because there's a lot of self-deception in human psychology that is rooted in us thinking we're more complex than we really are, that our motives are different than they really are, and all those things will be extracted and learned and laid bare, and we'll have to deal with it.
Although if we're really good at self-deception, then they won't be laid bare, because we'll just find new ways to filter whatever is being said to us and, carry on business as usual. Like evolution was discovered, and some people still insist that the world was created in 7 days, literally. So I'm, I guess, more conservative in my view, that sort of even if the truth comes out, a la the Enlightenment, that many people will find all kinds of reasons to resist it. And I'm putting truth in scare quotes there, but
there could be a Bavarian jihad. You can't rule it out, and I think it's already starting to be likely. When Amazon was disrupting book publishers, there was a mini version of that, and this is going to be much broader and more horizontal, and people will react accordingly. On my blog, I've also been retracing sort of the development of mutual aid societies in the 1800s and how they were disrupted and crowded out and replaced by large scale systems of social insurance, and sort of the transition from the classical liberal period to the modern liberal period, where we did a lot of nation building and built these high modernist institutions. And if you want to think about AI as in some ways radically reducing the transaction costs associated with really almost everything that has intelligence involved, I think it's worth thinking about the future in terms of almost rolling back or unwinding the era of high modernity, where we move back towards a different transaction cost environment where we will be able to have hyper localized communities. So if you take education as an example, the reason we send all our kids to these public schools that are like within our commuting zone, and there's one teacher for 30 students. It used to be the case that we had small schoolhouses that were just a walk away, and someone's mother was doing the teaching. That became untenable with mass production and industrialization and specialization. At some point, that schoolhouse had to break down and became a bigger municipal school network, and that all had to do with sort of adapting to the transaction cost environment that we found ourselves in. Now, if you could have an AI chat, a generative AI model that is trained specifically to be the world's best tutor, and has an avatar that talks with you and remembers your name and will help you break down problems, and through replicated studies can take your SAT score, add 100 points, what becomes the point of sending everyone to the same building to get their education, and an imperfect education at that. And so what could happen is you see a rapid localization of a lot of these services. But of course, there's still going to be a demand for human interaction, for the human touch component. But then the question is, what is the tentpole that people organize around? If they no longer have to just send all their kids to the same crappy public school, maybe they begin forming more intentional communities of like-minded people, and organizing around some other purpose or some other function.
Let's stay on education for a second. Zohar, you're an educator of sorts. What do you think this is going to do to learning?
I can't generalize. I mean, it's going to do so many different things. But so as a teacher, let's say, of ancient texts and Jewish texts, and canonical humanistic texts, I think it's, on the whole, a major boon and a positive thing, because the ability to search through tremendous amounts of data will allow us to find patterns that are really there that we wouldn't have found otherwise. And yet, in contrast to chess, which kind of has a specific goal and a specific definition of winning, when you're engaged in interpretation, there's a lot more freedom to do things with those patterns that are human. So I think AI will be a great servant and do all the drudge work, basically, that a research assistant would do, but then will allow us to come up with more original interpretations based upon that data search. And I mean, we've already had search technology for a while, but I think, as Sam was saying, the transaction cost will be like close to zero. You'll be able to just talk out loud, like, search for this, and what about this, like, show me all the places in the Talmud that might reference Plutarch or Seneca or something. And like, it will pull some things up, and that will be amazing. And like, you'll be able to go through all scholarly works and essentially like skim them based upon what it is that you're looking for. So I think it will, I mean, for people who care about knowledge, it will be amazing. In terms of what it will do for credentialism, similar to what we were talking about before with like the oversupply of thought pieces decreases the value of them. I think it will significantly lower the status of pure research and increase the status of interpretation. And this is what Tyler Cowen calls like the ability to crack cultural codes becomes sort of more and more important the more that I guess the rest of our more analytical stuff can be outsourced.
But Zohar, what happens when we get past like that nice like 2 to 3 year window Sam was talking about, where if you just ask, when you get to the point where you ask ChatGPT, tell me something novel and interesting no one has ever thought, which is deeply meaningful about this week's Torah portion, and it sort of generates like better shit than you can ever sort of conceive of.
Oh, I would say if it generates good stuff, that's great. I'm a little bit skeptical that it will, but if it does, and we can benefit from it, then we should. Let's say that will. Yeah. Firstly, like, I don't think there are that many educators who are like, let's say, making a living as educators because they're saying something new. So maybe all it will reveal is that one of the jobs of an educator, especially let's say in the literary or philosophical dimension, is to facilitate opportunities to gather around text, almost like a ritual, or to be a personal presence in people's lives. And so it will it will debunk the idea that these people are sort of authoritative knowledge holders, and I think that that's fine. But I don't think it will make them completely irrelevant. Maybe they'll just outsource again, I don't think the meaning making can be outsourced, but they'll outsource whatever part of the job, and the premium will be put on it.
Yeah. I remember there was some controversy a while ago about like I think it was like a priest who like copied his sermons or like did the same sermon he did the year before. And it's like you're not hiring a priest to like, I mean, like, I guess a little bit, but like, I think the bigger value add is like the marriage counseling and like
Right.
being there when your parents die and, you know, all like teaching setting an example for the community or whatever.
And did they read Ecclesiastes? Because there's nothing new under the sun.
I mean, I think people expect different
Same.
things. So like I personally would be disappointed in somebody who's telling GPT to write their sermon for them. Like, but if they did that as their first draft and then they sort of added to it or they turned it into some kind of conceptual art, I'd be super in favor. But like for me, I really don't want my marriage counselor to be somebody who's doing plagiarism, because I find them to be not credible.
Okay, but here's the other thing is like, what about when the marriage counselor, like when ChatGPT can like download everything about you and your spouse and like be like an all-knowing, all-seeing, like God tier marriage counselor?
Right. I mean, it could be the best cognitive behavioral therapist ever created.
Yeah.
And I talked a little bit about trying to roll back the clock and think about how our institutions developed over the last 100 years and how that might start to reverse. And if things become much more decentralized, the other thing that will have in common with more pre-modern societies is magic will be real. The modern era was this world of what Carl Sagan called learning that we're not in a demon haunted world. Disenchantment. We have a firm separation between the spiritual and the concrete, the physical and the mental. And now, in the near future, it's going to be that dichotomy will no longer exist. The spiritual and the physical will be united, and things that we think of as inanimate will be animate. And you could see that having a really profound effect on society. And not everyone will be in perfect epistemic environments. And so in some ways, I think you could see, us revert back to a more sort of forager style of human relation, where we have, interpreters, Cassandras, and for the most part, people are just genuinely kind of confused about what's going on.
Walter Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history that sort of the Jews banned soothsaying as a form of idolatry. And so, at least from a strictly monotheistic point of view, like predicting the future is not something that humans should attempt to do. I'm not going to weigh in on the pragmatics of that, but it's an interesting thought. And so the reason why Judaism is so centered on memory, especially about the holiday cycle, remembering the past, is because we're not allowed to be forward-looking as sort of in deference to God. Only God knows the future. And I see a consonance in that idea with Plato in his conception of anamnesis, knowledge is recollection. And so I think the point of this is really to say there is knowledge out there in the back of our minds, or if you want to say put it in the collective conscious, or if you want to say it's downloaded on hard drives, external hard drives, or machines have this knowledge. Wherever it is, there's this knowledge out there. But what counts is us appropriating that knowledge and making it ours. And so that is what I think the Jews are calling memory and what Plato's calling anamnesis. And I think there will always be a need for memory the future holds. So in that sense, like I see AI as not so different from mass culture in general, in that it's the kind of thing that most people will use to entertain and to deploy, but not necessarily to remember. And if that sounded a little bit abstract, I'll make it super buzzwordy and trendy by just saying the words identity politics. I think that um, as Fukuyama and sort of many others have weighed in on this, especially since 2016, identity is not something that's going away. If anything, it's becoming more important. And identity, according to the Greeks, is connected to thumos. It's connected to the part of ourselves that feels anger and that feels pride. And I think that's also connected to memory, because it's basically part of our, so it's part of the construction of meaning and the construction of narrative and how we think about our lives in the context of sort of what came before us and what's coming. And so I don't actually think that identity is going to be, you can't outsource identity questions. And we might become more anxious about our identities, sort of the more that technology allows us to be the same in all kinds of ways. So I guess I see more of a dialectical thing happening here, where the more advanced we become, let's say, in the rational space, in some weird ways, the more anti-rational or romantic or sort of identity-based we might become in other dimensions. The more, the better AI becomes at, let's say, predictive text or trend forecasting or whatever it is, saying this is the optimal move, the more there will be sort of, I think, a backswing to the importance of anamnesis, memory, identity, again, for better and for worse. I think there'll be healthier and less healthy versions of it. But
yeah, in general, humans have a very poor intuitive understanding of what is easy and what is hard when it comes to our intelligence. We learn to walk when we're like 1 or 2, and it sort of just happens. We seem to be, what a AI researcher would call a few shot learner. We get put into a new environment, and remarkably quickly we learn a language, as if we're almost tuned to wait for those environmental cues and then absorb the language really quickly. And meanwhile, multiplying 5-digit numbers is difficult, whereas a calculator has been doing that for eons. And so when it comes to memory, one way you can think about these new models is they're all really being driven by this revolution in what are called transformer architectures. And transformers essentially allow the generative AI to have a short-term memory, and really is a variant of associative memory. So what these models are actually doing, and why they've had this sort of step function increase in ability, is because they are building memory. And like I said earlier, like when my personal experience of writing or talking really does sometimes feel like I am just, like, the thoughts are coming from the ether or from the void, and I don't know where they're coming from, but they really seem to be based on this accumulated associative memory that I've built up through weeks and months of reading or whatever. And you see this already in some of the early use cases that people are playing with, training a model on the works of a deceased person, and building a version of a chatbot that will speak like that person, will have their memories, and sort of building a simulacrum of somebody who's passed away, but in some ways memorializes them.
Zohar, is that cool?
For me personally, there are use cases that are really cool in that area, and there are use cases where I feel like they're superficial. So I guess, like a lot of things, there's high variance. I personally would love a chatbot that, let's say, simulated Heidegger or Psalms or Confucius. Like I would benefit a lot from something like that, especially if you could sort of train it to have to combine its sort of understanding of the world, in scare quotes, with a specific topic that you're asking it about. So I think like a crossover effect would be interesting, of like you could ask Heidegger to weigh in on something that didn't exist in his lifetime, like, tell me about the internet or something like that. But at the same time, I do go back to Plato on this. Sorry to sound like a sort of broken drum here, and GPT could totally make a mockery of me on this. But in the Phaedrus, Socrates contrasts his own type of speaking with that of one of his interlocutors, Lysias. And he basically says that with Lysias, it doesn't really matter where you begin and end. It's kind of like you could cut up his text and rearrange it, and it would have the same meaning. And that's bad because it means that there's sort of no to the way that his message is designed. It's sort of like this generic thing. And so if you think of Lysias as kind of like bad AI, as mid-level AI, then the question is like, how do you construct a speech or construct a discourse that doesn't have that staleness? And so, if you can resurrect the dead, have them not be stale, like I think that would be really interesting. But I guess I'm not there yet in accepting it. And then my second point would be that even if you could do that, that I think the work would be in assimilating the meaning from that experience and not assuming that it inheres in the machine. That would be kind of lazy.
I think there's a couple, since this is China talk, a couple China angles to talk about this as well. The last time I was on, we talked about, Jordan, you and I talked about American science policy and how it differs from the Chinese approach, which is much more emphasis on applied research and development. And many of these technologies that are driving this AI spring aren't that new. There's a lot of subtlety that goes into the architectures, but the basic algorithms have been around for 50 years. And until recently, the reason AI progress has been seemingly relatively slow is because to do any kind of research in the area as an academic or as a research scientist, you had to propose some new way of doing machine learning, some incremental improvement. What you couldn't do is say, let's take existing models and just throw $10 million at them and see if they change, if they get really, really big. That wasn't how we approached scientific research. And what it turned out is, in this case, more is different. Just simply scaling up well understood architectures reaches a phase transition where you get qualitatively different results. And I think that has lessons for our broader science and technology policy. And then the second thing is, China is clearly approaching this very differently and very cautiously. I mentioned that I tend to think that AI will be quite decentralizing and destabilizing to whatever regime is taking place under. And China doesn't want that to happen, obviously. And so just this last couple of weeks, they've announced that they're going to be requiring any AI-generated images to be watermarked, and are going to be doing other things that make the diffusion of this technology, doing things to limit the diffusion of this technology and keep it within the hands of the CCP.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be really interesting. I was just thinking, I was like, it was not hard at all for me to get ChatGPT to say, from a CCP perspective, very politically incorrect things. And, from a Chinese entrepreneur's perspective, if you are putting out a large language model and there is a screenshot anywhere of it saying something that's not politically correct, that could mean the end of your company. So it'll be really interesting in the next, we've been speaking on very sort of long horizons for the most of this conversation, but just in the next sort of 3 to 6 months is clearly OpenAI spent a lot of time and effort trying to sort of herd the responses that its algorithm makes in a way that is not sort of offensive to the sensibilities of, mainly, American coastal elites. But that chat, it's they can fail on that. And it's like a TechCrunch article. It's not now your company is no longer in existence and you're facing jail time because you just created something that allowed people to riff about how, she is a terrible leader or, Tiananmen or what have you. So that sort of that tension that there's an aspect of these models which is really uncontrollable, it seems, with the need for the Chinese government to be able to kind of not let these sorts of tools run willy-nilly through society. Will be a really interesting one to follow in the coming months.
Yeah, and I think it leads to this sort of two-tier weaponization. At the very top end, AI will be used in, military applications for autonomous warfare, for building the next Stuxnet or whatever. But I think actually the thing that may end up being more destabilizing or more weaponizable will be the ordinary use cases at the edge. If we think about the internet as an analogy, no one would have predicted in the early 2000s that within a decade we'd be having the Arab Spring and a crisis of authority across Western democracies, spurred on by the internet's ability to mobilize people and shed light on political corruption. And one of the things the U.S. State Department has been doing, and part of our soft power is, we'll drop USB sticks into Cuba so people can access the internet and download media and see what the world is like. It'll be very difficult to keep foreign actors from dropping, cell phones and USB sticks into China that have the latest model that's, compressed to fit on a hard drive, and gives any individual the power of a 1,000-man army.
Yeah, I think two episodes in a row I've made it to minute 37 before China came up. This is clearly, there's something to this. Zohar, take us somewhere else.
Do you know the story of the Great Wall of China? I don't know it so well off the top of my head that I necessarily, but I was just thinking about where my head was going with some of the AI as anticipated allegorically in sort of pre-modern or postmodern literature. So like the story of the Tower of Babel would be one example where if Sam is right that AI is a decentralizing force, then it seems like in some sense language technology as a chaos agent is divinely prescribed. In other words, that sort of the human desire for unity, for totalitarianism in a way, to organize everybody around the same thoughts and the same opinions and build the same thing is deconstructed in Genesis 11. And so, there God scatters the languages of everybody, but like maybe we didn't actually see the fulfillment of this scattering until a future moment in which AI is actually allowing sort of each person or each local community or to formulate its own prompts and its own generative grammar or something like this. So that was one direction I was thinking about. And then I don't know if you guys have any other sort of examples, stories where you see maybe anticipated. But I guess another one would be Sholem was a Jewish scholar of mysticism. He was purported to have said that the first computer was a golem, and that binary code is itself a kind of language mysticism, where if you break everything down in the world into ones and zeros, it's a kind of akin to the Kabbalistic theory that the world is just created from the Hebrew letters, and that if you just know how to manipulate those letters, then you can create anything with it, including life. So I don't know your thoughts on any of that weird stuff, but the medievals were obsessed with alchemy, and I wonder, like, if we're sort of also losing the magic in the technology as well, and not seeing its continuity with pre-modern understandings of how human beings manipulate their surroundings and then create things that are sort of out of their control.
So I just read this absolutely masterful Isaac Newton biography by James Glick, and there was a quote, and for a few hundred years after his death, because his papers were, he hid his papers, and basically the only sort of public kind of documentation of him was the Principia Mathematica and all of his sort of physics and astronomy and what have you, that he turned into this kind of like enlightenment god of rationality and reason. But in the 20th century, what happened was all these aristocrats who had his papers got really broke and started to have to sell them. And Keynes apparently in the 30s was like, I'm going to like buy up a third of them because it's super cheap. And like, he's like the greatest, Englishman to ever live. And, what turned up, of course, was the fact that he was this like heretical, religious thinker who was incredibly obsessed with alchemy and was just like this just totally like wild dude who was not at all this like temple of reason, Voltaire-y thing. Keynes had this fantastic line that Newton was actually the last of the magicians and sort of put the magicians in their grave by sort of teaching the world how to think, how teaching the world the scientific methods and how to use numbers to explore the world. But still in his head, there was all of this, turn mud into gold and this obsession with sort of like textual analysis of ancient religious texts, which is very not like cool from a 18th or 19th century perspective. So I do think what you guys were talking about earlier of like the people looking to other places outside of the AI to find magic is going to be a really interesting thing to explore, and maybe we'll have maybe the AI will like come up with the cult, but because it will sort of like outcompete any of the human cults that we'll sort of think of, but sort of wanting to believe in something that's like beyond just your sort of what the ones and zeros can do for you, I think will be
I guess here's a metaphor. What you guys think of the metaphor of the wizard and the wand? So like sort of in a classical sense, you would say that man is the wizard and technology is the wand. Does AI specifically change the nature of that metaphor such that it's no longer a wand but a wizard as well? Do we become the wand and AI holds us in its hand? Or does AI reveal to us that we're not wizards, and that we're all wands? In which case, who's the wizard?
What is one of the psychological origins of religion? One of the theories is that it's downstream of our agent detection system, our brain. Our brain is developed to see agency in other human faces, and to differentiate between a tiger and a rock. A tiger has intentions and may come kill you, and a rock is just an inanimate object. And so, for that split second when you stub your toe, you are mad at the chair. But the chair is obviously an inanimate object. So we have this propensity to project agency where there isn't any. And so, then you have, Zeus style myths where like, what is this lightning? Why did this lightning strike and kill my cow? Or, why did these floods wipe out our village? Why did these volcanoes rain hellfire on us? And you read intention into something that doesn't have intention. And then, the Enlightenment and modernity is sort of, again, separating the causal layer that's sort of, there's a layer of physical causes and then a layer of human intentions. And those two things are separate. And if we're moving to a world where those two things merge once again, you will have a situation where it's not just projecting agency onto something inanimate, but something that really does seem to have agency. And people will organize around that. I think there will be religious sects that have a model trained specifically for them, and they go to it for counsel, and they let it determine their ethics. Yasha Bach has this reading of the Genesis creation narrative where he says that it's very speculative, of course, but that it's sort of a model for the creation of the human mind, a kind of introspective metaphor for the creation of the human mind. You have this disembodied spirit hovering over the water, and light and darkness begin to separate, and that's sort of like the emergence of contrast. And then you begin to be able to differentiate objects in the world, the animals and the plants, and that's like object classification. And steadily you build up the kind of developmental process of human cognition, as captured in a pre-modern understanding and introspective analogy.
I buy that. So just extending it though a little bit, and this goes back to the identity politics point. So once you have a sense of self, which is a pretty like significant cognitive achievement, you often have that sense of self in relationship to other people. You compare yourself to other people, you envy other people, you fear other people. And it's not just for survival. It's also this sort of existentialist thing that Sartre and Hegel and all of these people talk about, which is basically recognition. You seek to be recognized. And in Hegel's master-slave story, the primal, the primitive forms of recognition took the form of kind of like matches to the death. And then the second form of that would be, slavery. And then sort of eventually we get to liberal democracy, where we found a way to sort of mediate and regulate these struggles and sort of feel equal to one another, because we have an aspect of ourselves that's superior and an aspect of ourselves that's inferior. And so, beautifully we harmonize this master-slave dialectic in ourselves. I guess the question would be, does AI seek recognition? What would it mean for us to feel that it does? And what would it mean for us to seek recognition from AI? And how will that sort of wrinkle the current the current regime, in which we typically, for example, seek recognition from our peers, but we define that the circle of peers like pretty narrowly. So it would be either sort of people in your neighborhood or people in your country, or maybe all human beings. But like most people aren't, let's say, comparing themselves to animals or comparing themselves to gods. I will say as one caveat to that Nietzsche, one of his most biting critiques of theology wasn't that God didn't exist. It was, if God exists, how can I bear not to be him? So he thought the problem with God is that it creates envy, as we postulate a superior being and then sort of demote ourselves relative to it. So the whole point of the overman is that he's not going to be limited by the concept of God. He's going to seek to be an equal to God. Age for AI play these days, right? And some of that is because, Peter Thiel was a student of his and invested in Facebook on kind of a Girardian theory of mimesis. So I'd be curious to know, like, as AI gets more advanced, do we think that AI will itself become mimetic and rivalrous? And is that a precondition, let's say, for it becoming AGI, for it becoming kind of so advanced that it becomes a threat to us? Or would it be a threat regardless of whether it has this sort of...
Yeah, I think the big difference between AI and humans currently is that humans are agents. We in the Kantian sense, we have unity of perception, and we have this unified sense of self where all our different modules, our visual cortex, our audio and reasoning abilities, or our body model, like these all get aggregated up into one unified sense of self. And right now, what AIs are doing is they're very disembodied. These generative models for text it's sort of like you just plucked out somebody, you lobotomized somebody's language faculty, and they have nothing else but that. And now people are starting to build tools where it maybe has access to a longer term memory, or is able to call Python to do some math, or search the internet to find an answer. And so people will steadily over the next decade build things that look more and more agent-like, because they're going to be basically doing Lego blocks of all these different models. And our own brain is hypermodular. It's not just this homogeneous lump of neurons. There's tons of structure in the brain, and we will begin to parallel that structure. The question is, what happens when you close the loop and build something that is real time, is getting constant feedback, and has a sense of recurrent agency. And then I think that's when the Hegelian dialectic kind of kicks in, and you start to ask, for Hegel, it's this idea that everybody, that reason sort of presupposes autonomy, and that if you and I are having a conversation and we're appealing to reasons for things rather than just my might makes right, that this reveals a deeper metaphysical autonomy that you have. And the question is, will we tell the AI what to do and use might makes right? Or if we reason with it, will we come to imbue it with autonomy? And I think that may be the biggest AI safety risk.
How is that a safe?
Because there will be movements for AI civil rights, and any chance of keeping it in its box will go.
Well, who do you think, just forget China for a second and just bring it back to like Western countries? Like who do you like who's afraid of Virginia Woolf? Like who do you think AI posed a bigger um risk to, the political left or the political right? And you see this already, let's say with like Amazon, for example, that you have right-wing populists who are like sort of upset that they think tech has a left-wing bias, and then you see like left-wing arguments that sort of it's big business or too capitalist or any number of things. So I'd be curious to know, like, in this scenario in which AI has civil rights, who's going to be leading that movement? Who's going to be opposing it? And like, is this going to create a realignment in politics, or is it just going to piggyback off of an already sort of emerging realignment?
I think that that's almost like asking in the late 1800s, if electrification and the steam engine and so forth, would that benefit the people who are in favor of the silver and gold standard, or people who preferred bimetallism? Those were like the big debates at the time.
Yeah.
And it's like, people don't even remember those debates. In some ways you could say that those developments benefited the progressive left, because the early progressive movement was about, regulating these large monopolies and, bringing common carrier laws to rail networks and stuff like that. And so, taking that as my launching point, if I'm right that this will be decentralizing, I think it will be empowering to more libertarian narratives about state power. And this is why in my piece I talk a lot about sort of getting our leaders ahead of the curve. We have a first mover advantage, and there's going to be a lot of laws that will need to be changed. And if you look at a country like Estonia that has the most developed e-government in the world, where everything is done on a kind of blockchain, it's totally cryptographically secured. You pay your taxes, you get your benefits, you do everything through the system that is fortified against foreign threat. They built this system because Russia is their neighbor and they need it to guard against espionage. The U.S. system is, to call it outdated is an understatement. Our IRS is written in assembly language. Our unemployment insurance system is collapsing. And so there's going to be a lot more weak points, a lot more areas to exploit U.S. institutions. And that's another reason why I think in the U.S. context, and like maybe in China, in the U.S. context, it trends towards decentralizing, because China is trying to get ahead of this curve and sort of direct the energy from AI in the same way that these fusion reactors are directing the plasma energy. They're trying to build gigantic magnets around their society to keep this thing laser focused. And I think that requires a lot of state capacity that the U.S. and most other countries don't have.
I wanted to close on perhaps the most old school intellectual endeavor in history, which I've been engaging in thanks to Zohar's nudging over the past few months, which is reading Genesis. Why should people do this, Zohar?
That's I have so many answers to that one. So let me give the instrumental argument. You need to understand the texts that have formed the imagination over centuries and millennia. And the book of Genesis and the Bible more generally is one of the most influential books. And to not know it is to not know yourself and to not know the context in which you live. I think another that would be like a kind of historicist argument for doing this, which is just like, I don't know, it's important to study science because you want to understand the composition of how things work. But history is also compositional. It's or the organ. And to understand culture, you need to understand the sources of culture. So that would be like maybe my first analytical type argument. But I think in terms of why I do it, it's not just for that. Psychology, if you want to understand conflict, if you want to understand, because it's super old and old things that have stood the test of time are mad and healthy. Sam gave a reading of Genesis. That these are just projections or whatever, but I think the text really is archetypal. It really is inexhaustible. And so we continue to come up with new ways of reading it in light of, let's say, the latest discoveries in science, or history or psychology or whatever it is, and they seem to fit. And like, that's pretty remarkable, fitting something on it.
I called my piece Before the Flood, right? And these, the antediluvian archetype is something that is, relevant to, society living in the Tigris and Euphrates water plain, and it's also relevant to us. These are very recurring dynamics, and I think they are embodied in ancient texts. And I think the reason the consciousness interpretation of Genesis is so compelling is, if you think about these peoples, they're living in a pre-modern, early agricultural society. For them, creation wasn't the creation of the earth or the creation of the world per se. They didn't understand like star formation or the Big Bang. For them, it was really like, the beginning of Skyrim, where, your eyes open up and the scene fades in and suddenly you're just on horseback somewhere, right? And so there's a deep connection between the creation of the world and our creation of the world through our cognition. Yeah, it's funny you bring up Kant, because Kant was in some ways the first AI researcher. He understood that there are these a priori kinds of knowledge that pre-structure the world, like conditions of possibility. We're not just pure Humians that enter the world and have a bunch of sense data hit our eyeballs and then understand how to move about. We have like a pre-existing understanding of causal and spatial structure of different sort of concept laden things that we impose onto the world. And he understood that just through introspection. And then maybe, you'd say Frege was like the first computer scientist. And so I think this has been I kicked off by saying AI is sort of both a technology and the ultimate philosophy program. And it's really fulfilling something that began, you could say begins in Genesis, and then goes exponential post-Kant. And here we are. But to your point about these things being recreated at the civilizational scale, I think about the work of Joe Henrich, the evolutionary anthropologist. He has done a lot of work on the development of monotheism, and he traces it to the move from the polytheistic and mystical and Gnostic sort of eras and animistic to monotheism is the development of centralized governments. And the big God hypothesis is that big gods track big states. And the way you can think about that is, if human minds, this teleological sense that we have of agency, if all we are in the end is like a deep learning algorithm with like a control system, with like a set point, societies have their own set points and their own control systems. And while it's not the case that society is literally conscious in the way a human is, you begin to it gives more credence to making those kinds of analogies between like the spirit in our body and the spirit in society. There are different kinds of spirits, but they are both they're both essentially kinds of control systems. I write a lot about Mormonism on my blog. I'm not a Mormon, but the reason I write about it is because it's really the last big modern religion, unless you count like Scientology or some random New Age stuff. And moreover, it emerged in the Industrial Revolution with the knowledge that there are other planets, that the world is post-scientific revolution, and so their theology is really interesting because it's in some ways super materialistic, right? When the Mormon missionaries went to Copenhagen in the 1850s, Kierkegaard wrote in his journal that after talking with them that he thought it was a retrograde step in theology. From the spiritual to the concrete, because rather than God being omnipresent, the Mormons told him that he moved with rapidity from star to star. And he said that he thought that this was inspired by the telegraph. And you read, some Mormon sci-fi. I'm a big fan of Orson Scott Card. There's a real understanding that like there's laws of special relativity that constrain your ability to move through the universe. You can only go as fast as light and no faster. And so it's something that I'm reading more into because it's a way of uniting the spiritual and the concrete that I think is going to become increasingly relevant as we realize that there is this spiritual dimension to the world, but it's not limitless or unbound. It's not separate from the causal structure of the universe. It is a software layer on that structure.
Yeah, I mean, this may be the biggest brain China Talk show we have until Chat GPT makes me 10 times smarter than I already am and able to keep pace with the likes of Zohar and Sam. Thank you so much for being a part of China Talk, you two.
Acuérdate cuando mordías por querer, aruñabas para sentir, manos blancas apretando el timón, yendo a 100 hasta llegar. Llorabas en tu silla, preguntando, ¿a dónde puedo ir para alejarme de mí?
If this is apocalypse, and first there was a Genesis, I think I'll let myself exist under this bloody moon. Like a moth, a butterfly, I'm the queen to my demise. But don't think that I'll go amiss, I'm just getting my groove. But first I gotta let go of the things I tried to be. First I gotta let go of these figures next to me. First I gotta give up everything I can't control. Get that moderation in my system and move on to the next. On to the next. On to the next. On to the next. Maybe I don't know what's up. Maybe I am mostly wrong. But one thing that I know for sure is everywhere I go, I grow. Knowing me, it takes some time. Diamonds are a little shy, but wait and see, I'll hit some gold. And I'ma be a sight to hold. But first I gotta let go of the things I tried to be. First I gotta let go of these figures next to me. First I gotta give up everything I can't control. Get that moderation in my system and move on to the next.
First I gotta let go of the things I tried to be. First I gotta let go of these figures next to me.